mention at the outset that there is tremendous power to spending the day with us, and more people seem to be doing that. So particularly if you're fasting, where else are you going to go? So stay with us. And there's some wonderful, wonderful features of the day, including during the break in the afternoon, we keep the ark open and allow you to come up and stand before the ark and stand before God with just a private moment. I also want to tell you that for the first time in our history, we're staying in the Machzor for the Ne'ilah service. The reaction to the Machzor has been so powerful and good that we're leaving those pamphlets and we're staying in the book for Ne'ilah. So because it's a new experience for all of us, I'm going to say we're going to conclude at 6:40. How's that? 6:40, so you can make your plans, get away. Of course, we conclude for those who wish as the whole congregation gathers for the beautiful Havdalah service, which is very quick, but very, very lovely. Do want to remind you, I saw some of the 5 o'clock service coming out, and one of the families had lots of extra food bags. That's great, but at least bring back yours in the morning. That will be vital to our numbers and vital to those who are very much in need of that food stuff. Please don't leave this book at your seat. Barbara Zakin, our wonderful executive director, and her creative team have put together a beautiful book of all the programming, social action, social justice, spiritual, adult education. I know you've wanted to get more involved. There's plenty for you to get involved. Even the cantor and I are giving a two-parter and what's going on in that sanctuary anyway, talking about the structure of our service and how we attempt to accomplish what we do. And I'll tell you one other really lovely thing. A few years ago, we started on Simchat Torah, which will be on a Sunday evening this year. This coming week, of course, Sukkot, and the following Sunday is Simchat Torah. So, we finished the Torah and we begin the Torah again, so we thought, as we begin the Torah, wouldn't it be nice to invite all of those students, either at the Rodah Shalom School or the religious school, who have a bar mitzvah date? And they have a big aliyah, and already 2 weeks out, we have over 70 of our kids coming up for that aliyah and Simchat Torah, which I think is just wonderful and talks about the power of connection, which we are trying to build in every possible way. And you'll find lots of those opportunities in your community engagement book. The people had every right to wonder if the first Yom Kippur would ever take place. Aaron, the high priest, was to don his ecclesiastical robes and offer up a bullock as a sin offering, setting another into the wilderness as the scapegoat, making it possible for the people to atone and start over. But would Aaron even show up? His heart was still broken. His sons Nadav and Abihu had spent 7 days training to offer sacrifices in a precise, prescribed manner, ascend the stairs on the 8th day, and proceed to offer what the Torah calls Eish Zarah, strange fire, for which they paid with their lives. The high priest was stunned into silence. So were the people of Israel. What had happened? The Torah jumps to the conclusion they might have committed purposeful idolatry. Really? The sons of Aaron? The nephews of Moses and Miriam? Perhaps they were intoxicated, the Torah intimates. What if neither is true? What if Aaron's sons, like many of our own children, were simply yearning to live their own lives, wanting a chance to dream their own dreams, to be holy, but not in a narrow ritualistic sense of offering the right animals in the right manner at the right time? Nadav and Abihu stood at Sinai too. They answered as the people did to a whole series of precepts in partnership with God. Is the sacrificial rite important? Absolutely. But they well knew already what the prophet Isaiah was to tell us hundreds of years later, that sacrifice was not the ultimate spiritual act, but a means to an important end. They understood that ritual had to inspire us to deal your bread to the hungry, to bring the poor into your house, to loosen the chains of the oppressed, and never to hide thyself from thine own flesh and blood. They heard nothing of that in 7 days of preparation. Their work was rote, listless, maybe meaningless. Perhaps they felt trapped in a scenario not of their own making. Perhaps they saw the life that mattered, a life that made a difference. Aaron did show up for Yom Kippur. Perhaps not as a sense of priestly duty, but an act of atonement for being blinded by his own ambition and desire to please God at the expense of his own children. Perhaps he was now taking responsibility for his own actions, for his failure to look into the pleading eyes of his children and to say to them, Hineni, I am here for you. Aaron took responsibility. Today, in this holiest of days, we're called upon to do the same. To be sure, and as we spoke on Erev Rosh Hashanah, these are not easy times. We feel whipsawed by people and events all around us. So much seems out of our control. Some of us are filled with outrage. This is not the country I've always taken pride in, we may feel. These are not the values that I preach and try to live. Many of us feel this, say this to each other, wring our hands. The question is, do we say, Hineni, I am here and I will not be silent? I will respond. This frenetic year is reminiscent of 50 years ago, 1968, a year which historian Mark Kurlansky called the year that rocked our world. Thousands would die in Vietnam, our campuses, hotbeds of political action, as selective service terrorized many of us. With the specter of being drafted to fight a war many of us could not support and did not want to die for. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., battling depression and the premonition that his days were numbered, travels to Memphis, Tennessee to support the strike of sanitation workers on April 3rd of that year. With premonition, Dr. King preaches at the Mason Temple, I just want to do God's will. He's allowed me to go up the mountain. I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And we know he did not. Nor did Robert F. Kennedy, who spoke in Indianapolis that night and pleaded with his nation to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. He too, of course, was gunned down in that incredibly divisive, violent year. And yet, many of us remember 1968 with pride. Pride. Because people came to realize then that they were not powerless, that they could speak out and march against an insane war. They could help bring about civil rights and women's rights. That youthful generation had the temerity to believe they could right wrongs with their heads, hearts, souls, and aching feet, and could bring about change. Some years later, in 1995, we at Congregation Rhoda Sholem hired only the second lesbian rabbi who had the courage to come out to her congregation. A few years later, we rose as a full sanctuary to offer Rabbi Angel and her bride a standing ovation. We were clapping for them, of course, but we were also clapping for ourselves, for the very real journey we had taken to understand that every human being, whatever color, religion, nationality, sexual orientation, and now gender identification, is created in the image of God and deserves to be treated as such. We who were treated as non-persons in Egypt knows what it means to have our identity taken away, basic freedoms stripped. We understood that Egyptian bondage was the bondage of a people to the arbitrary power of the state. Well, we think we left Egypt long ago, but did we really? Perhaps we're in danger of returning to Egypt and giving up personal freedoms that which have been the hallmark of this great democracy. Women, we know, are in danger of living under a patriarchy in which mostly white men, congressmen, senators, the majority of the Supreme Court attempt to deny the most basic controls women have over the direction of their lives. And let us not fixate on the fate of a single Supreme Court decision. Because in fact, if you have no providers for hundreds of miles, if there is no medical and financial coverage, if a frightened young woman is bullied or preached to in order to get the care she deserves, there really is no right. You and I know that this would not happen in a million years if men were blessed with the same reproductive organs. No one would tell them what they could and could not do. No way would congressional men imperiously peer down from their glasses and continue to send women to the back of the bus. We remember that well when Anita Hill got a full dose of it. And let's see what happens in turbulent, powerful Senate action this coming week. In this context, what do I mean that we might return to bondage? Well, what did it mean before Roe v. Wade? Whoopi Goldberg talked recently about using a coat hanger because she was desperate. Hundreds, thousands died from illegal abortions. Connie Bryson tells of her experience in 1953. He was a medical doctor, yes, but the surgery was sadistic and barbaric. He scraped out the contents of my uterus with a razor on a stick. He gave me no anesthesia of any kind. He wanted me to suffer. He wanted to humiliate me. When he finished, he forced me to look at the product of the procedure, and he warned me to stay away from boys. Then he told me I had a beautiful body, and he sexually molested me. I meant to be graphic, because these stories need to be told. 1 in 3 women in this country will have an abortion, and they rarely do so cavalierly. They do so because their compelling life circumstances, often desperate life circumstances, sometimes impoverished life circumstances, make it necessary. In 2018, we must do everything possible not to deny women their basic health care. We really can never go back to Egypt. This is not a time to stay dormant. We must do all we can, no matter our age and our stage. We should even tell this to 3 elderly Jews sitting on a traffic island on Broadway one day. They were not talking about world affairs, but more immediate concerns, pressing concerns, the ability to void. Max says, "It is so hard to be 85 years old. I get up at 7 o'clock, I go to the bathroom, and nothing happens. It takes me absolutely forever." Morris says, "I know what you mean. Every morning I try to move my bowels. It's very painful." Irving says, "I know, getting old is not for sissies." Max, so what's your problem, Irving? Well, every morning I wake up at 7 o'clock and I have no problem going number 1. 8 o'clock when it's time to go number 2, easy peasy. Irving, that's wonderful. Sounds everything is fine. No problems at 7, 8 o'clock, number 2. What's your problem? My problem is I don't get out of bed till 9. Even for Irving, it's important to get up and move forward. Yes, we can never return to Egypt. We are in the wilderness. We're far from the promised land, but we have to continue to strive to reach it. Let me say this. I love this country. I am a proud American. I am grateful to this land which so many times has opened its arms to the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses. Opened its arms, for example, to my Bubba, who had no one, no English, but a will and a gumption, who underwent the arduous journey all alone, avoiding the fate of her parents and most of her siblings. You feel my love and gratitude, and I think you share it in almost every case. So if persona or policies threaten the ideals of our Declaration of Independence, if persona or policies undermine our democracy, if persona or policies sanction the bigotry that once produced unprecedented suffering for our own people, if they sanction or shrug off those marching through an historic American city shouting, "Jews will not replace us," if persona or policies undermine the rights and opportunities of all those too often made to feel that they do not belong in this land, then when we speak out, when we march, when we wear out our voice or our shoe leather, we are expressing our love for this country and what it has always stood for, expressing our patriotic yearning to become again one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I love Israel. Ever since I huddled with my classmates around a transistor radio, scared that the Six-Day War would be their last, I have loved and been dazzled by the Jewish homeland. I lived in Israel for an entire year, been there at least 30 times, taken many groups, including Rosh Hashanah congregants, testified before the Knesset, shared my boundless admiration and profound connection. When persona or policies threaten to undermine her democracy, when persona or policies undermine the principles of her own Declaration of Independence, when persona or policies send a clear message that all of its citizens are not equal and do not have the same opportunity or access to justice, when we speak out, we do so out of real love and hope that Israel lives up to her own promise. I've said this before, and it bears repeating. Do not believe the polls that tell you that the next generation cares less about Israel than we do. They've been to Israel more than any other generation in the history of the state. They understand how miraculous Israel is. They, as we, simply want Israel to do all it can, surrounded by enemies and feckless Palestinian leadership who have never given peace a chance, but want Israel to create laws and vision to help the Jewish homeland live up to her own stated ideals. And it has to be said and has to be borne witness to the fact that Israelis exhibit the kind of compassion and kindness that is rarely reported and simply not found too many places in the world. For example, I want you to know that Israeli medical personnel treat soldiers that even seek to kill Jews with dignity and first-class care. And I was very moved by a book written by Dr. Alicia Waldman, pediatric oncologist whose practice is treating Jews, Muslims, and Christians at Hadassah Hospital. And Dr. Waldman writes, when you have a child with a massive tumor growing in their little body, you'll do anything to help. A mother waiting through checkpoints, carrying her child in her arms, never knowing if she'll reach her destination, while exhausted Israeli medical personnel having worked a double shift, but knowing how long it took her to get there, wait and wait, because they want to be able to do everything they can to save this Palestinian child's life. Untold stories that we need to tell. They are heeding God's call to act as if the Holy One walked in our midst. They're living embodiments of Rabbi Hirschberg's teacher, who said to his students, Kinderlach, if you have no compassion, what makes you Jews? We Jews learned in the 30s and 40s how little compassion existed anywhere. We remember that walls were erected and borders slammed shut. Our parents, our grandparents were desperate for some country, some politicians to recognize our plight. We say Kaddish for all members of our family who died as a result. Well, today, people are escaping countries where certain death awaits them and their children, as we did. They again raise their eyes towards America and plead, we are the tired and the poor, the huddled masses. Won't you help us? And you and I, we at Road of Shalom, have answered, yes, Hineni, we can help. And with tremendous communal effort and pride, as you have heard, we have resettled refugees in New York City, helping them with jobs and apartments, welcoming them with open arms and overflowing hearts. They are not Jews, they are Muslims. We resettled these terrific young men because our Jewish values so dictate, because it is the way we can finally leave Egypt and look towards the promised land. But I don't have to tell you that there is so much more that needs to be done. In New York City, in our town, a woman with multiple myeloma who is undocumented told her doctor she would not continue chemotherapy because she feared the federal government would deport her for receiving medical care. Many more people than we realize are weighing the risk of death by disease versus deportation. In our city, there are more than 1 million undocumented immigrants facing these agonizing choices every day. In our town, on the west side, many people do not feed their children properly because, for example, they don't want to wind up in WISCA, West Side Campaign Against Hunger's database. They don't give their children basic health care. They don't report crimes perpetrated against them. They don't report domestic violence, don't drive because they can't get a license, and because a broken taillight can deliver them to immigration and customs enforcement. How can any church, any mosque, any synagogue, any school, any children of God possibly stand for this? We did not, and we shall not. For Isaiah's words must penetrate our kishkas and provoke real righteous anger. Will you call this a purposeful fast, an acceptable day to God? Only if you loose the feathers of wickedness, only if you deal bread to the hungry, only if you bring the homeless poor into your homes, and never hide thyself from thine own flesh and blood. Nadav and Abihu, sons of Aaron, may have looked at the destiny carefully laid out to them by their parents and decided it was not enough. It did not meet this standard. They who came out of Egypt and stood at Sinai had to do more. Perhaps they wanted to live a life of higher purpose, a life of meaning, a life that would make a real difference to people in urgent pain. We must honor that desire in our own children. We must model those values not in word, but in deed. As Professor Michael Walzer once wrote, wherever you live, it is probably still Egypt. There is always a better place, a promised land. The way to that land is through the wilderness, and there's no way to get there except by joining hands and marching together to the land that God will show you. there's always something you can do, something you must do. Do it.